The worlds of film and video games have had a bit of a turbulent relationship over the years. Though there have been an odd few movie tie-in games that have been pretty good, check out our other list to find out which ones are our faves. For the most part though, they tend to be shameless cash grabs that do nothing more than milk a couple of extra dollars out of the proverbial property cow. For this list, we're taking a look at the cinematic masterpieces that have been directly responsible for some of the biggest sacks of tripe to ever be committed to our consoles and or PCs. Naturally, the words brilliant and awful are entirely subjective, so we're going based off the critical reception of both the films and the video games included on this list. If the general consensus is that the film is good and the associated video game is ploppers, then they shall be treated thusly. With all of that said and done, I'm Ashton from TripleJump, and here are 10 brilliant movies that spawned awful video games. Number 10, Highlander 1986. Is Highlander the best movie ever made? Probably not. Is it a whole load of quirky, cheesy fun with some of the strangest casting choices ever committed to film? Oh my god, it sure is. Released in 1986 and starring Frenchman Christopher Lambert and Sean Connery as immortals from Scotland and Spain respectively, yes, those actors are the right way round, do not come for Sean Connery's Spanish accent, okay? Highlander tells the story of the Immortals' secret war. The whole thing is completely over the top, but it's for that reason that audiences loved it so much. The video game, on the other hand, also released in 1986 for the ZX Spectrum, Commodore 64 and Amstrad CPC, was not a hit with either critics or fans of the movie. Though players had 3 different opponents to beat, most were unable to tell them apart, and in terms of the actual fighting element in the game, there was little in the way of skill required beyond being able to mash the attack button. Though it received harsh criticism for its clunky gameplay and uninspiring graphics, the main complaint that most outlets had was that Highlander committed perhaps the worst sin known to video games. It was very boring. Number 9, The Wizard of Oz, 1993. There have been a number of film adaptations of L. Frank Baum's The Wonderful Wizard of Oz over the years, but the 1939 effort starring Judy Garland is by far the most successful. Despite not making an awful lot of money for Studio MGM, The Wizard of Oz won 2 Oscars and is cited by many critics as being one of the greatest films of all time. The same cannot be said for the 1993 SNES platformer of the same name. At release, it received reasonable reviews, but upon contemporary reflection, a number of publications ranked it amongst the worst movie-based video games of all time. Like in the film, the plot follows Dorothy, the Cowardly Lion, the Tin Man and the Scarecrow as they travel through various locations in order to meet the titular wizard. Among the complaints were the inclusion of settings from the 1990 animated series, which critics found odd considering the game was marketed as being based on the 1939 movies, as well as the weird choices in terms of the game's mechanics, such as the fact that the Tin Man couldn't jump, despite the game being a platformer. Perhaps Dorothy should have asked the wizard for a decent video game instead. Number 8, Thor God of Thunder. It's been a bit of a turbulent ride for developers who've tried to get the Avengers to make the leap from the silver screen to our games consoles. And though there have been some winners, such as 2018's Spider-Man and the 2021's Guardians of the Galaxy, there has also been some downright stinkers. One game that falls into the latter camp is 2011's Thor God of Thunder, a title based on the eponymous Crown Prince of Asgard's first cinema outing. Although Thor isn't exactly a piece of classic cinema, it did really well with both critics and audiences, garnering review scores that averaged in the high 70s and grossing a massive $450 million worldwide. Thor God of Thunder, on the other hand, fared pretty poorly, with the Xbox 360 and PS3 versions averaging just 38 and 39 out of 100 respectively. Like many movie tie-ins, God of Thunder suffered from a distinct lack of soul, with many reviews accusing it of wasting the potential of the property. It was also criticised for its difficulty, which spiked to downright frustrating levels at several points throughout the game. Not all was lost for God of Thunder, however, as the DS version actually did quite well with critics, and whilst it wasn't exactly groundbreaking, it was a fun little Thor-themed brawler. Number 7, Back to the Future. Regardless of how upset you were when 2015 finally rolled around and there were still no hoverboards in sight, it would have been nothing in comparison to the disappointment that Marty McFly fans felt upon the release of the Back to the Future video game. If you're unaware of the concept behind Back to the Future, though if you are, I suggest you reevaluate your priorities in life. The plot follows protagonist Marty as he inadvertently travels back to 1955 in a DeLorean time machine. Whilst there, he accidentally sets off a chain of events that would prevent his parents from getting together, so he spends most of the film's runtime trying to ensure that they do in order to save both his bacon and that of his siblings. The game, released in 1985 for the ZX Spectrum Commodore 64 and Amstrad CPC, loosely follows the same premise. But where the filmmakers got things oh so right, the developers got them oh so wrong. Most critics agreed that the game just wasn't very fun to play, because whilst watching Marty try to get his parents together with varying degrees of success is interesting as a passive spectator, it's not all that engaging when you're forced to intervene. Number 6, Enter the Matrix. Forget about the red pill and the blue pill, because clearly the teams at Shiny Entertainment and Infogrames took some sort of hallucinogen when they decided to unleash Enter the Matrix upon the world. Based upon the Wachowskis' dystopian series, the story of Enter the Matrix runs parallel to the franchise's second movie. Rather than focusing on the exploits of Neo, Morpheus and Trinity, you know, the characters people were actually interested in, the game follows Ghost and Niobe as they attempt to reach Zion and coordinate its defences before the machine's attack. Though both The Matrix and its sequel, The Matrix Reloaded, received a positive reception from both critics and audiences, the response to Enter the Matrix was much colder. Several reviews noted how it felt unfinished, not only because audiences were only getting half of the story out of the game, but also in terms of the actual gameplay. In and of itself, splitting a narrative between a film and a video game is not a bad concept, but in the case of The Matrix Reloaded and Enter the Matrix, it felt like the movie ended up with all of the good ideas, whilst the game was left to make do with whatever scraps were left over. Number 5, pretty much every Shrek game ever made. Oh, look everyone, we're doing a wildcard entry! How quirky and fun. Before it was released in 2001, no one thought much of Shrek. The studio had so little faith in it, in fact, that animators would be banished to work on Shrek if they failed on other projects. In spite of this, Shrek became a cultural phenomenon, earning itself an Academy Award, and has even been selected for preservation by the United States National Film Registry. Sadly, whatever magic was sprinkled over the first Shrek movie was not shared around any of its video game adaptations. Shrek, the video game, which was also released in 2001, garnered pitiful averages of just 36 and 49 out of 100 for its GameCube and Xbox releases respectively. And whilst the 3 sequels did alright with critics, the same can't be said about most of the series' spin-offs. Shrek Swamp Kart Speedway was a particularly low point, averaging a frankly embarrassing 26.4% upon its release in 2002. Reviewers rightly pointed out that it was nothing more than a substandard Mario Kart clone, intended to cash in on a well-loved franchise. Excuse me, hi, all of you rubbish Shrek games, I'm gonna have to ask you politely to vacate my swamp. Number 4, Home Alone. In fairness to the 2006 video game adaptation of the 1990s Home Alone, neither of the first 2 games inspired by the franchise were any good either. But by comparison, both Home Alone the video game and Home Alone 2 Lost in New York the video game are works of art. Released solely in Europe, Home Alone for the PlayStation 2 is so bad that even Macaulay Culkin himself isn't willing to play it. It lacks any kind of faithfulness to its source material, with the idea being to lock the burglars inside the house and kill them with various projectiles. Say what you want about Kevin McAllister's methods, but I don't think he ever intended to murder Harry and Marv. Bizarrely, the game is also set during the springtime. Now, it's been a while since I've seen Home Alone, but I'm pretty certain that there's a subtle Christmas theme running throughout the film. I might be misremembering it though, so don't quote me on that. Though it wasn't a complete slam dunk with critics, Home Alone the movie is beloved holiday watching for many families, whereas Home Alone for the PS2 is the video game equivalent of getting coal in your stocking. Number 3, Beverly Hills Cop. You might think that the horrible Crazy Frog cover of Axel F was the worst thing to happen to the Beverly Hills Cop series, and to be honest, you'd be right. The PlayStation 2 video game is a very close second though. Upon its release, Beverly Hills Cop received universal critical acclaim. The movie not only gave Eddie Murphy perhaps his most iconic film role as a wisecracking Axel Foley, but it was also nominated for numerous awards, as well as making the American Film Institute's 100 Years, 100 Laughs list. Quite bafflingly, some 22 years after the original film was released, Atomic Planet Entertainment and Blast Entertainment unleashed Beverly Hills Cop on the good people of Europe. Not only did they fail to secure the rights for Eddie Murphy's likeness for the game, making Axel Foley unrecognisable in the process, but they managed to get everything else wrong as well. The story is basically non-existent, the graphics look like they'd have been more at home on the Nintendo 64, and the whole thing is riddled with bugs. One critic even went as far as to call Beverly Hills Cop the 9/11 of video games. And whilst those two things are obviously not comparable, the game is still pretty darn awful. Number 2, Aliens Colonial Marines. How could we possibly do a list of awful games based on good movies without at least giving a nod to Aliens Colonial Marines? Though Aliens was a bit of a departure from the first Alien movie in terms of tone, eschewing most of the horror in favour of action, it was still incredibly well received by both critics and audiences. The film even received an Academy Award nomination for Sigourney Weaver's performance, with everyone basically agreeing that her character Ripley elevated Aliens beyond simply just another sci-fi action romp. For years, video game fans were crying out for an adaptation, and though the wish was granted in theory with the release of Aliens Colonial Marines in 2013, players were far from happy. The game was a glitchy, buggy mess, filled to the brim with low-quality graphics, lackluster gameplay, and aliens that weren't even remotely scary. Some players even went as far to file a lawsuit against Sega and Gearbox, claiming the game that was advertised in demos was nothing like the final product. And in fairness, they weren't wrong, and Sega ended up settling for a cool $1.25 million. I just hope they bought enough change for the bus ride home, eh? And number 1, E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Never in the entire history of movie tie-in video games has the contrast in quality between a game and its source material been quite as stark as it was for E.T. the Extraterrestrial. If you haven't seen the film, it tells the story of a young boy named Elliot and the friendship he develops with an alien called E.T. stranded on Earth. E.T. must do everything he can, with the helps of Elliot and his chums, to make his way back to his home planet. The movie garnered universal critical acclaim, was the highest grossing film of all time until Jurassic Park was released, and won no less than 4 Academy Awards. The video game, on the other hand, was a complete mess. Developers were given less than 6 weeks to churn out the game in time for the holiday season, with Steven Spielberg himself expressing doubt up front regarding how successful the title was likely to be. Upon release, it initially sold fairly well. However, as soon as players realised what a heaping pile of tosh it was, a little under a third of the 2.6 million copies sold were returned. These days, E.T. the Extraterrestrial serves as a little more than a cautionary tale of the dangers of rushed game development, but at the time, it nearly destroyed the entire industry. Phone home? More like, phone the police, there's been a crime against Steven Spielberg.